Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tackling the absolute, undisputed foundation of any thriving saltwater aquarium. Based on our source material, we're looking at why water quality is so much more than just a number on a test kit. It's the core requirement for stable salinity, safer chemistry, and long-term coral health. When you really get down to it, the water you start with literally dictates the success of the entire ecosystem you're trying to build.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's incredibly common to just assume that if water is safe for us to drink, whether it's straight from the tap or poured from a bottle, it's got to be perfectly fine for our reef tanks, right? Well, actually, scratch that. The reality is that seemingly clean water might be harboring invisible threats. Your source water could actually be the hidden variable that's secretly stressing out your entire reef ecosystem, day after day.
Because everyday tap water is usually hiding this whole cocktail of elements. We're talking calcium, magnesium, trace metals, phosphates, and just an overall elevated level of total dissolved solids, or TDS. Now, here's the tricky part. These contaminants, they don't typically show up as massive, immediate toxins that crash a tank overnight. Nope, they sneak in. Every single time you top off for evaporation or mix a fresh batch of salt water, you're slowly, quietly accumulating these extra elements, pushing your tank's delicate chemistry further and further off target.
And this brings us to a fascinating but honestly deeply frustrating phenomenon known as mineral creep. Basically, this is the gradual accumulation of unwanted ions and dissolved solids, and it completely tricks hobbyists. At first, your basic test kits might look totally normal. You check your parameters, think, hey, everything's fine. But behind the scenes, this gradual shift in alkalinity, hardness, and overall ionic balance is happening right under your nose.
So what happens when we let mineral creep run the show? Well, it creates a perfect storm. It actively fuels the growth of that stubborn nuisance algae that you spend your entire weekend endlessly scraping off the glass. And even worse, it acts as a slow, continuous stressor on your sensitive invertebrates. It complicates your daily reef management and kind of turns what should be a really relaxing hobby into a constant, frustrating battle against invisible forces.
All right, moving to section 1, the solution. Which brings us to RODI systems.
So, how do we actually stop this cycle? The ultimate fix here is utilizing RO/DI, which stands for reverse osmosis and deionization. Think of this as a two-part defense mechanism to strip out impurities before you even open your bucket of salt mix. Step 1 is the reverse osmosis membrane. This is the heavy lifter that strips out the vast majority of dissolved solids. But step 2, the deionization stage, is absolutely critical. And this brilliantly illustrates why. The DI resin catches the remaining ions that the RO membrane alone might leave behind. Having both stages is what dramatically lowers your starting TDS, making sure virtually zero unwanted ions enter your system. The contrast here is just stark. Tap water gives you unpredictable TDS and introduces hidden variables every single time you use it. RO/DI water, on the other hand, it gives you a beautiful, blank slate baseline. By stripping the water down to its absolute purest form, you achieve tightly controlled chemistry. It finally stops you from constantly wondering if your incoming tap water is that mysterious culprit causing your parameters to drift. You can confidently pinpoint and address issues inside the aquarium itself rather than constantly fighting your source water. Now, what's really interesting about this is how directly this purity translates to the health of your corals. Corals and delicate invertebrates in general absolutely rely on clean, carefully controlled chemistry. When impurities are present, they trigger severe stress responses in these reef-building organisms. And you'll see it. That stress manifests visually as reduced polyp extension, muted dull coloration, and noticeably poor growth. In a coral-dominated tank, consistency matters just as much as purity. And RODI water provides that essential stability.
Let's move to section 2, stabilizing salinity and algae control.
Let's look at how this builds into incredible cascading benefits for the day-to-day management of your saltwater ecosystem. So the crucial point here is that your salinity readings are heavily influenced by the water's dissolved content. If your baseline water is full of random invisible impurities, it skews absolutely everything. But with the clean baseline you get from RO/DI water, your dissolved content is completely predictable. This means mixing your salt to a target-specific gravity or taking readings with a properly calibrated refractometer becomes incredibly reliable. You actually know exactly what is in your water. And that reliability directly supports consistent top-off and water change routines. When evaporation happens, only pure water leaves the tank, leaving the salt behind. By topping off with pure RO/DI water, you maintain perfect equilibrium. This dramatically reduces those salinity swings that can be deeply stressful or literally deadly to fish and corals.
This is especially vital in smaller setups, like nanoreefs, which naturally just have significantly less buffering capacity to handle rapid environmental changes. Furthermore, we've got to talk about algae. Some tap water sources naturally carry measurable levels of phosphates or silicates, and even in small amounts, these nutrients act as high-octane fuel for nuisance algae and diatom outbreaks. Now, using RODI water doesn't magically eliminate the nutrients that are already being produced inside the tank from fish waste or leftover food, but what it does do is completely block you from actively importing extra algae fuel from your tap. Lots of reef keepers notice a massive improvement in persistent algae problems once they make this switch, for sure, especially when they pair it with good feeding habits and effective filtration.
All right, on to Section 3, maintaining your RO/DI advantage.
Of course, just owning one of these systems is only half the battle. To keep this massive advantage, here is a super practical maintenance checklist to ensure you're actually getting that blank slate water. First off, it's a best practice to actively monitor your water output with a TDS meter. You also need to keep a really close eye on the maintenance intervals for your pre-filters and routinely inspect your RO membrane. But most importantly, you must verify that your DI resin is still doing its job and isn't running exhausted. Because if that DI resin is spent, or if any stage is underperforming, the water you're producing simply isn't as pure as you assume. And boom, you start importing those hidden variables right back into your reef.
There's this quote directly from the source material that really ties this all together beautifully. It says, "For reef aquariums, where small chemistry changes can compound, starting with cleaner water is one of the most practical upgrades you can make." And that really hits the nail on the head. It completely removes that hidden source of variability. Every single gallon you use for mixing and topping off is pure, giving you the absolute total control you need to foster a thriving, healthy ecosystem.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If small chemistry changes silently compound over time, what hidden variables are compounding in your tank right now? Think about your source water. Think about what might be creeping in every time you top off. Taking control of your starting water might just be the absolute best thing you ever do for your reef. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and happy reefing.